until the mid to late 50s and part of the 1960s. Over here to your right, we have black box modernism. Remember that black box building by Trump Tower? And I said you would see a lot of those kind of buildings downtown. Here's the reason why. Black box modernism, popularized by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and the idea is that they're going to follow two tenets. One, less is more. Two, form follows function. Let's start off with less is more. Compare this. These buildings are stark, they're dark, they don't have any ornamentation or decoration of Art Deco. Why? Because the people that designed and built these buildings, they just went through the Great Depression, they just went through World War II, and they became a little bit more financially conservative, and who can blame them, right? A lot was going on. They're not going to sit and argue how many gargoyles they're going to put on top of these buildings. The other thing is form follows function. Well, these are office buildings, and what are office buildings designed to do? Why, hold business, and that's it. So the form follows the function. These aren't going to belong in a museum, so they don't need to look the coolest of the cool. They just need to do what they say that they do. Now, it's not to say that these buildings, they are soulless or heartless. They do have a social function as well. These buildings, black box modernist buildings, they don't use the entire lot space. They actually have plaza space around it to try and bring people together for a social function. Now we go from the 1950s and 60s to the 1970s with international style. So the world becomes a smaller place, right? Because it's a small world after all. And we start to have changes in transportation and communication to connect the U.S. with the rest of the world. So we need to have an architectural style that represents that. So the architects of the United States, they're like, hey, we're done with making big black boxy buildings. And what do they come up with instead? Well, look to your right, folks. They came up with big white boxy buildings. So we're not thinking outside the box just yet. But the idea with international style, it has that softer exposed concrete, right? And the idea is that you can theoretically see a building like this in any city in the world, including your hometown. So now we go from the 1970s to the 1980s. We finally think outside the box. Take a look at that green curved building. That is going to be an example of contextualism. The 1980s, we have big shoulder pads, big hair, we want our buildings to be cool, but we want them to fit in, not stand out. So contextualism, fitting in with your surroundings rather than trying to stand out to be too postmodernist cool. So that ends our 100-year journey through architectural history, from trying to copycat European styles to Art Deco of the 1920s to black boxes, white boxes, and the flagship of contextualism in the 1980s. Now, if you look over here to your left, folks, we never really talked about this building up until 2014, until they decided to put the map on themselves and put us on that map. Take a look. That is a map of the Chicago River, and that Y all the way at the top, that Y is Wolf Point. And that's where the three branches of the Chicago River meet. And that little red-orange Lego brick, that's us. Give yourself a nice little wave, folks, because that's where you currently are, on the Chicago River. And those lines on the map, that's the grid pattern of the city. And I'll talk more about the grid pattern later on. All right, movie fans over here to your right, if you've seen the 2008 movie The Dark Knight, you might be familiar with this building, Gotham City Bank, where Heath Ledger's Joker, he ziplines on top of Gotham City Bank, and he and his goons are going to sneak inside the bank, steal a whole bunch of cash, and jump out the front in a school bus and race down Van Buren Street. The only thing, that's not a bank, that is Chicago's old post office. And for several decades, it actually lay vacant up until a recent renovation project that cost about $900 million to gut the interior and make office space for companies such as Uber, PepsiCo, Walgreens. Now you might be wondering, why did they just destroy that building? Well, you see that bridge in front of us? That is one of our highways. And if we were to destroy the building that lies on top, because notice the highway actually runs through the old post office, it would have been much more expensive and much more tedious to commuters in Chicagoans. They don't like traffic, just like any of us, so that would have really caused a lot of bottlenecking. All right, now we're about to go on the quieter part of our tour. You might be wondering, well, that doesn't sound quiet because we're going under a highway. Rest assured, as soon as we pass through the highway, it gets quieter, and I'll tell you the next step shortly. economics teacher by trade, but I actually began my teaching journey by teaching preschoolers. And there's a lot that connects all of us that I found. And one of the things that I found from preschool to high school to working with people from all different age groups, backgrounds, and walks of life on these boat tours is we all like a good story. Chicago, we have plenty of good stories, and I'm going to give you 3 of them right now because it just seems all stories nowadays, they come in a trilogy, right? So here's my trilogy for you. They're going to be called Ashes, Hope, Rejuvenation. Ashes, Hope, and Rejuvenation. All right, let's start off on a dreary note with Ashes. So, remember how I was saying a lot of people were coming to Chicago because of its connection with the river and Lake Michigan? So many people are coming here, but we need to build buildings, houses, roads, sidewalks fast to keep up with the amount of people coming here. So we use local material. What was that? Lumber. So we had an entire city made out of wood, and with a name like Ashes, you can probably guess where this story is going. So, over here to your right, just about a half mile inward, a fire is going to erupt on October 9th, 1871, in an Irish immigrant's barn by the name of Mrs. Catherine O'Leary. And the fire is going to jump over the Chicago River and ravage downtown. Now you might be wondering, what's going to cause that to happen? Well, let's take a look at the facts and the fiction of the Chicago fire. First, the facts. How does a fire jump over a river? Remember how I said that the Chicago River was heavily polluted for much of the 1800s and 1900s? It was so polluted that there was actually, caked on top of the Chicago River, a layer of oil, which caused the Chicago River to literally catch fire. And what else caused the fire to jump over the river? Well, there's 30-mile-an-hour winds that day that caused fire cyclones to cause the fire to jump over the river. And it's going to reach downtown, and in totality, it's going to destroy 17,000 buildings. 100,000 people are going to be without a job, without a home, or both. It's going to kill over 300 people. It's going to devastate 3.5 square miles of city space and reduce it to ash. And it's going to cost $4 billion in damages. And since I'm an economics teacher, you can better believe that's just for inflation. So now, that's the facts. What about the fiction? We don't know what caused the Great Chicago Fire. We did our own Billy Joel impersonation just to say we didn't start the fire, but there had to be somebody that did. So we had to find a scapegoat, and their scapegoat was none other than a hellacious heifer, a malicious milker, a bad-to-the-bone bovine. Our scapegoat was actually a escaped cow. The idea was Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocked over a lantern in her barn, which then caused the Great Chicago Fire. But there's going to be 2 good things that come out of this story. One, Mrs. O'Leary and her cow are both going to be exonerated in 1997, so about over 100 years after the Great Chicago Fire. It's a little bit late for both of them. But the even better news was it's going to lead to our second story, which is hope. So, architects from all across the country, they're going to be like moths drawn to the flame to Chicago, because in Chicago they see a blank canvas. So, architects such as Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright and Chicago's own Daniel Burnham, they're going to come to Chicago and they want Chicago to rise like a phoenix from the ashes and take its worst moment and make it become its greatest moment of opportunity. And within 22 short years, Chicago is back on the map. They actually create the world's first skyscraper, a building over 10 stories tall, and they're going to make all the new buildings fire safe, have these fire safety cones to prevent another disaster like this from happening again. All right, so Chicago, they're not done yet, because in 1893, a lot of American cities, they're competing for the right to host the World's Fair. In Chicago, they're going to win out. So for 6 months on Chicago's South Side in Jackson Park, where you'll find the Museum of Science and Industry, which is actually a building from the 1893 World's Fair, something cool to check out. You'll also find University of Chicago and the future home of the Obama Presidential Library. So for a 6-month stretch on Chicago's South Side in Jackson Park, guests from over 40 different countries, 27 million in total, they're going to go through the turnstiles of the 1893 World's Fair. And they're going to see over 200 white ornate buildings illuminated in the glow of electricity. And they're going to see some other modern marvels that happen there. They're going to go through the white city in the glow of electricity. They're going to see some other modern marvels such as brownies, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, spray cans, washing machines. the elevated rail car, and the debut of the piece de resistance, the Ferris wheel, because the last World's Fair was hosted in Paris, France, and they unveiled their coup de grace, which was the Eiffel Tower. So not to be outdone, they had to come up with something cool as well. So those 27 million people from over 4 different countries, they're all going to go home. Just like if you guys are going home outside Chicago. They're all going to go home and talk about how Chicago's back on the map and they're here to stay. And they're going to talk about how Chicago just became such a beautiful city. And I want you to take a look to your left, folks. Do you not see a beautiful city right now? Get those photos in. Great view from the South Branch. So get those photos in and I'll tell you the third part of our trilogy here with rejuvenation.
Well, it's going to be, so a lot of business owners are going to kind of take the gamble on it. And architects were willing to take the risk because they knew that essentially they had a blank canvas. They had a bunch of lot space moving forward. If you want to build one prestigious downtown, it's going to cost a lot of money because you didn't have as much room. So now that it all got devastated, like, okay, we need some help. So we kind of get a little desperate. So a lot of local business owners, they got some loans from the federal government.
All right, now let's finalize the last story. So we go from ashes, the worst thing that ever happened in this city, but I'm going to explain how it was also the best thing that ever happened in the city. Because the city that lies in front of you was devastated. It was reduced to rubble and ash. But then the fair provided that hope. And now we'll talk about how exactly do we create the beautiful city that we have today. And that comes from a plan in 1909. So you remember Daniel Burnham? He was the guy that's going to be the lead person behind the 1893 World's Fair. The local business leaders, they loved so much what he did with organizing the fair that they said, hey, would you like to be the lead guy to plan the city? And he does. And he creates what's called the City Beautiful movement. And that's what we also call the Burnham Plan. Because he wants to create cities where people feel more inclined and more motivated to want to go to rather than be turned away. They want people to walk through and see the beauty of cities rather than just industry and pollution and crime. So what he does is he wants to create Chicago as a city and a garden, right? And that just means we have about over 600 park space in Chicago. 9% of our land space is actually going to be park space. The idea is you can walk out from any business, any building, any condominium, apartment, and be able to be within 5-minute walking distance of a park space. Lincoln Park is our biggest park, and you'll find that on the north side. It's actually 1.5 times bigger than Central Park in New York City. And there you can find the Lincoln Park Zoo, a free zoo. Also, kind of close to where you guys got on the boat initially at Michigan Avenue, just head on south, you'll hit up Grant Park, where you'll find a museum campus with the Field Museum of Natural History, and the Adler Planetarium, the Shedd Aquarium, and Buckingham Fountain, Millennium Park with the Bean. All different things that show how Chicago's a beautiful city. What else? Well, you'll find double-decker streets, Upper and Lower Wacker Drive, to help reduce congestion and traffic, because traffic is not a good view for a beautiful city. He's also going to have the idea of having alleyways in between buildings so that we don't stage our trash in front of buildings that you see in some East Coast cities. So they're staged in between buildings. He's also going to reimagine the grid pattern of Chicago, where our streets are at 90-degree angles, so it's easier to navigate. And you'll have the addresses by 100 blocks. Okay, because in other cities you have kind of like zigzaggy, windy roads that have no rhyme or reason to them. So, some other things we'll see along the tour, the Riverwalk and Navy Pier later on. And this all comes from this plan in 1909 where Daniel Burnham says, make no small plans because they have no magic to stir men's blood. And without that man dreaming big dreams back in 1909, the beautiful city that we see in front of us doesn't come back from its worst moment with the Great Chicago Fire. Now let's bring it back over here to the right. Bertrand Goldberg, another great example of a city within a city. But this one's just kind of like chopped down and spread out. It's got serpentides and snakes along the Chicago River. You guys are going to need Chicago royalty for the next 75 minutes. Everybody's going to want to wave to you, so get ready to get those hands and ready to wave.
within a city.
But as that city within a city approach with the yachts below, you have the office space, places to work, daycares, right below where you're living.
But entertainment.
Some other cool things to check out while you're in, to motivate you to keep coming back. Remember how I said the skyline's always changing? Well, this building has actually only been under construction for about less than a year. Just think about how quickly buildings kind of spring up in Chicago. And who knows what the skyline could look like in 5 or 6 years. So keep coming back to Chicago and keep checking out Shoreline Sightseeing for another tour to see what's different from when you jumped on today. All right, now let's talk about the royal family of Chicago. Mr. Tall, Dark, and Handsome back there with the 2 white antennas. That's the king of Chicago. Right in front of him, we have the queen of Chicago. That's 311 South Wacker with that octagonal crown at the top. And over there to your right, you see that little statue at the top? Kind of looks like a princess tiara. That's going to be the princess of Chicago. And let's start off with the princess over here. So it's a faceless statue that kind of looks like the Oscar statue. But it's not the Oscar statue, it's actually the Roman goddess Ceres, and she's the goddess of agriculture. And it shows our agricultural history in Chicago. And that building is actually the Chicago Board of Trade. A lot of agricultural futures were initially traded there, and since then, other commodities have been traded there as well. You might also know that building as Wayne Enterprise from the Dark Knight movies, and for the 1970s movie, The Untouchables, that's depicting the gangster culture of bootlegging with the Capone mob of the 1920s. More on that a little bit later on. All right, let's move back to the Queen right in front of us, 311 South Wacker, finalized in 1990. We had Texans on board. Where are they at? We had Dallas over there. There we go. Thank you guys for the pink Texas granite that adorns the exterior of this building. And something cool, something interesting about this is how it shows how Chicagoans, we show respect and appreciation for the wildlife around us. Because when this building was initially built, they wanted this building to stand out at night. And they actually filled the top crown with 1,800 fluorescent tubes to really have this building glow. The problem is that it disoriented the local flight patterns of local birds. And they would mistake that building for the moon, and they would continue to fly around it until they would die of exhaustion. And that's not a good look for a city, because we care about our natural environment. So what do? They did 2 things. One, they replaced the fluorescent tubes with LED lights that are more eco-friendly and fuel efficient. The other thing that they did, they dimmed the lights during migratory seasons to not disorient the local wildlife, and other buildings in the skyline have followed suit. But now let's take a look at Mr. Tall, Dark, and Handsome behind her. That is going to be the tallest building in Chicago. That is the Willis Tower. But what do Chicagoans like to call it? Sears Tower. Now which one is it? Is it Sears or Willis Tower? It's just like me. Am I Brandon or Tom, or we're both okay? So Chicagoans, they can be a little bit stubborn. Right now, it is officially the Willis Tower. The naming rights go to the Willis Insurance Brokerage Group. Fine company. Nothing against them. It's just Chicagoans, like I said. We can be stubborn, and they grew up along in Sears Tower. Some Chicagoans will call it Sears Tower for the rest of their days. Let's come back to talking about, though I said it's the tallest building in Chicago. And from 1974 to 1998, tallest building in the world. And now sits at the 12th tallest building in the world, 3rd tallest building in these United States. So how do we figure out the actual height of the building? Well, that comes from, and I kid you not, the Council on Tall Buildings. And we figured that out by going from the lowest open entryway for people to get in and out of the building, and you go all the way up to the top of the tallest part, the tallest roof. But you see those white antennas at the top? Those aren't actually included into the overall height of the building because they're seen as temporary mechanical equipment. But you remember that toothpick that was on Trump Tower? The spire? That is included in the overall height of the building, but I consider that architectural cheating because nobody works up in or lives up in a spire. So the tallest building in the United States is actually One World Trade Center, which actually stands at a patriotic 1776 feet tall. And if you were to just stop at the actual roof, don't factor in the antennas or the spires, Sears Tower is actually bigger than One World Trade Center. It's just One World Trade Center has a very large spire at the top, which gives it its nice little edge. That's what causes them to win. All right, you see those black box buildings? Gives you a nice little, over to your left, we talked about them when we looked at the time machine. They're roughly the same height as those antennas at the top of the Sears Tower. So just think about how big the Sears Tower is already, and then you just smack on top of that 2 big buildings as well. And there's a good side of it again. We're just under the shadow of the Sears Tower. This is going to use another way to reduce sway. Now when we come from under the building, you'll take a look at how there's a bunch of columns that kind of work together. It's not just one giant column that you might have seen with like some other buildings. There's actually 9 columns. They're all 75 by 75 feet. And the idea, this is called bundled columns. And all 9 columns, they support each other at the base to try and reduce the tension of swaying from the wind. So bundled columns is another way to reduce sway. Also look straight up. You see those 5 plexiglass boxes? I want you to give it a nice little wave, because that's our sky deck. So you can actually head on up, over 1,000 feet up in the air, and head on into this plexiglass box and look straight down at the people below. A very cool, authentic Chicago experience. So definitely check that out, so long as you're not afraid of heights. And you also get the best views of Chicago by day if you head up in the sky deck. I'll tell you where you get your best views of Chicago by night later on this tour. All right, now I want to tell you a little bit about some stories people really like to hear about. Has anyone ever climbed to the top of the Sears Tower? It is the tallest building in Chicago, at one point the tallest building in the world. And I'll tell you one story in particular. There's a Frenchman by the name of Alain Robert, and he climbed the face of the Sears Tower, what's called free solo, meaning he only climbed with just his hands and his feet and his wits about him. And when he successfully climbed to the top, he was also successfully arrested. So don't get any ideas there, folks. Now, when he climbed to the top, they also asked him, why did you climb such a tall building without any special safety equipment? And his response was, and I kid you not, well, I'm afraid of heights. And he would continue to climb some of the other tallest buildings in the world to get over that fear of heights, is what I presume, including the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa, which is designed by none other than Adrian Smith. Hence why we call him the world's tallest architect. I want to bring you down to I Love over here to your left. You see those metro trains underground? So Chicago's interesting because they have a combination of their trains are like subways where they're underground, and they're L's, which stands for elevated trains, where they're actually above ground. So it's a nice mixture of both. What's fascinating though is that these buildings, if they're built on top of underground train lines, they have to pay what's called air rights. So in case you're thinking about leasing out one of these giant office buildings, that's just another expense that you'll have to think about along the way. Alright, so I want to jump to talking about some more Chicago nicknames, and I have a good one I want to share with you later on. But we're called the city that plays and the city that works. Now, I'll talk to you a few ways of how we have entertainment and fun in Chicago. With our museum campus, right? We actually also like entertainment and the arts. We actually have over 200 different theater companies in Chicago, and there's a bunch of different venues that they can display their talents. One of my favorite buildings, and a great example of Art Deco, look over to your right, the Civic Opera Building. It looks so pretty, especially from the riverside, just being at the river view. 2 things I want you to notice here. Take a look at Civic Opera Building. What do you notice about building? See that red squiggly line underneath? They forgot to right-click and do spell check, because they spelled building wrong. It's actually a nice little nod to ancient Latin script, because U and V were coalesced into one character. Another cool thing about this building, it looks like an armchair, like just a nice little seat to have. And the armrests were actually office space that were supposed to be leased out to companies and have that rent money pay for the operating expenses of the main opera building, which acts as the seat of this chair. Very cool idea, very intuitive. The problem, this building was finalized construction 2 weeks after the Great Depression. So timing is everything, folks. Now we go from the city that plays to the city that works over here to your left. So a lot of companies, they've called Chicago home. They had their headquarters here in Chicago. At one point we had the Boeing Aeronautical Group called Chicago home. And this is one of their office spaces that they currently occupy. Right, but they weren't the first company to call this office building home. Well, here's a nice little nod to figure out who was there before. Look at the top. You notice those 6 holes in the roof? What do they look like to you? Some people say they look like salt shakers, or where a salt shaker should go. And that's a nice little playful nod to show who was there before, Because who occupied that building? Why, it was the Morton Salt Company. So they want to leave their presence, forever known, etched inside or on top of this building. And this is a great segue, since we're talking about salt, it's a great time to talk about the 5 main Chicago food groups. Deep dish pizza, Polish sausages, Italian beef sandwiches, Chicago style popcorn, we already have some people that grab some Garrett's, the Garrett mix, right? And of course, Chicago style hot dogs, which are going to include mustard relish, pickles, tomatoes, onions, sport pepper, salt on a sesame seed bun with Vienna beef hot dog. What is the one thing though that you don't include on a Chicago style hot dog? Ketchup. So make sure you don't do that. I'm not sure where it comes from. Maybe because you already have tomatoes on there. I'm not sure. But just don't do it because you don't want to be the publicly ridiculed person that orders ketchup on a Chicago hot dog. Will they actually ridicule you? No, they won't. No, they won't. You can get ketchup on a hot dog, but for whatever reason, it's left off of a Chicago style hot dog. All right, so I want to talk to you another nickname that I like for Chicago. We are the Windy City. Now, a lot of people think that we're the Windy City because we have unseasonably windy days. Unlike today, which actually turned out to be a gorgeous night after a little bit of rain. It actually comes from our local politicians in 1893, like leading up to 1893. We were trying to host the Chicago World's Fair. And, like I said, Chicagoans, we can be a little bit stubborn.